inflammation is not a bad thing, right? Inflammation is the way we fight infections.
Yeah.
It is excessive inflammation, which seems to be associated with a lot of problems.
Hi everyone, this is Doc M. I'm your champion of well-being, and welcome to another episode of The Edge. I'm super excited this week because I've really been waiting for this conversation with this guest, and you're going to understand why after I give you her introduction and we get into the conversation as well. Dr. Bonnie Kaplan, she is a research psychologist and semi-retired professor in the University of Calgary's Cumming Medical School in Canada. For many years, she's been involved in studying developmental disorders in children, especially ADHD and reading disabilities as well. And that led to her role in looking at the way nutrition affects mental health and brain development as well. She is the co-author of the book, The Better Brain, which talks about how we can search for a cure for mental health and its issues, not only within medicine, but actually within the role of food and nutrition as well, managing stress, anxiety, depression, ADHD, and through other nutritional interventions as well. She's established 2 nutrition and mental health funds managed by completely independent community foundations. She's studied nutrition from many different perspectives, and I can't wait to jump into the content with her. Dr. Bonnie Kaplan, welcome. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Thank you for that very lovely introduction.
Thank you. I'm so glad to have you with us. And a question I love asking all of our guests, particularly now because we all meet each other virtually, is where are you in the world and what's it like where you are?
Well, I'm in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, which is in the western part of the country. And Alberta as a province has been doing not too badly lately. We're up to about, I think, over 60% vaccinated. And about 3 hours from now, I'm getting my second shot of the Pfizer. So I'm very excited about getting that. I think it'll make me feel a lot more comfortable.
I'm sure. Fabulous. Well, fantastic. Well, thank you. It's my first Canadian guest of the series, so that's a fantastic start. I'm going to begin with a very simple, fundamental question, something that we all have probably learned incorrectly at school, and it is, what is food?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because I heard a very famous individual who I cannot name the other day say that food was just whatever you put in your mouth. And that's not what food is. Food is what we have to consume in order to build our cells and to enable our cells to function so that all of our organs can function. And so when you look at it that way, may I elaborate on that, Marcus?
Of course, yes.
A little bit. So when you look at it that way, then when I tell you the following fact, you'll see why it's the most horrifying thing that I've learned in the last at least 5 years. And that is that in North America, anyway, and I suspect it's different in India, and we can talk about why, but in North America, literally more than 50% of what we are putting in our mouths does not qualify as food. And that's a horrible thing, because when you cut your micronutrient intake, and I can explain that word later, but cut your micronutrient intake by 50% voluntarily, then we have a big social experiment going on. And I think we're seeing the results already.
Yeah. So you're saying half of everything that's consumed that we literally put in our mouth, that's not food. And that's because it's a substance, but there's no nutritional benefit to it.
Right. I shouldn't, nothing is black and white.
Yeah.
Not in anything, not in politics, not in nutrition, nothing. But ultra-processed, it's called ultra-processed food. I have trouble with that label because, as I'm telling you, it isn't food. But also, ultra-processed products do have the macronutrients, and that is protein, fats, but they're usually the wrong fats, and carbohydrates, but they're usually simple refined carbohydrates. So the macronutrients are there, but they don't have any of the micronutrients, which are the minerals and vitamins and the good essential fatty acids. And they don't have all the other phytonutrients that we get from when we eat our food from plant sources. So they are nutrient free from the point of view of what we know our brain needs all the time, but there are the macronutrients.
And that's really important because a lot of folks think about their diets, and people typically think about it through the lens of weight loss. But as we're going to see through this conversation, the role of food as medicine has got so many other benefits as well. People are very focused on that macronutrient consumption of the plate. Like half the plate should be X fibers, X fruit and vegetables. Then there's a carbohydrate, there's a protein, there's a fat intake, etc. But what Bonnie, you're really focusing our energies towards is this idea of micronutrients and where that fits into the calorie or what we therefore put into our mouths ultimately.
That's right. The micronutrients really are not, they're a whole separate issue from calories. Yeah. The micronutrients are what our cells need to grow, what our cells need to function.
Yeah. So let's maybe ask the follow-up question, which is if the quality of food is going down, obviously there's a choice between eating ultra-processed foods, but even within the other remaining 50%, is there any evidence and science around the quality of that food with regard to the nutrients, the micronutrients within that? And then the follow-up to that would be, what might be the causes of that reduction in quality?
Yeah, this is actually a kind of discouraging topic, Marcus. The truth is that there's very good evidence accumulating that the nutrient density of our food is going down. And a lot of it has to do with soil, which is not properly balanced. It also has to do with the fact that current estimates are that something like 97% of the arable land in North America is saturated by glyphosate, which binds up the minerals from the soil so that our plants cannot grab them as well and cannot use them to synthesize the vitamins we need. So, and also, I mean, in our book, we talk about the problem of climate change, because ironically, you would think that the increased carbon dioxide in the air would make plants grow more, and they do get bigger, perhaps in some circumstances, but it is also reducing the nutrient density of our food. So we have a lot of really big discouraging factors there that are so hard to solve. But there are people in the regenerative agriculture field who are trying very hard to get the word out of the importance of improving the nutrient density, the mineral density of the soil. I should probably add something here, because your listeners, I've discovered people don't always know how we get our vitamins and minerals, and they don't understand that we cannot synthesize vitamins or minerals, except some of the little, if our guts are working well, if we have a healthy microbiome, some of those bacterial elements can in fact manufacture a very small amount of the B vitamins, but it's so negligible, it's not worth looking at. So how we are supposed to be getting our food is this way. Plants absorb minerals from the soil if the minerals are there. And that now is a really big if in soil that's been turned and used for many years. And farmers have been putting on basically just fertilizer, which is NPK, which is sodium and phosphorus and potassium. And they're did I say sodium? Nitrogen. Sorry, the wrong word came out. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And sometimes some calcium, but there should be at least 15 minerals in a healthy soil. Then plants absorb those minerals and they use them, and they do a lot of things with the minerals, of course. I mean, they're geniuses at photosynthesis, which we can't do, etc. But they also synthesize approximately 15 vitamins. So then we come along, we eat the plants, or we eat the animals that eat the plants, and we should be getting roughly 30 vitamins and minerals. And it appears as if we no longer are.
Yeah. There was a very powerful slide which I saw you present at a talk you gave a couple of years ago. And I think you were looking at soil samples across North America, maybe parts of Canada, and actually measuring the levels of each of these key elements. And I think apart from whether it was magnesium, which was high. Everything else was below the 50% of the recommendation line. And that was a staggering graph to just sit back and see.
That's true. That was a random sample, and it was across 3 Western provinces. So British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan. Oh, actually 4. Manitoba was in there too. And those samples were shocking. And, buried in there, I don't know if I mentioned it, I don't always have time to mention it. People are always saying, well, what if I eat organic? People don't understand that organic is a separate issue. Organic means pesticide and herbicide free. And that's a worthy goal in itself. Absolutely. But it doesn't mean nutrient dense. But it just happened that in those, I think we had about 40 samples, we just coincidentally had one sample of an organic farm that was almost adjacent to one sample of a non-organic farm. And the organic farm, we think of them, organic farmers are better stewards of the soil. I'm pretty sure in general that's true. But in that one sample, there was really no difference in nutrient density.
It's really quite scary. And I think, for the listeners who are watching this from parts of India and various parts of Asia as well, we have been on this pursuit of Western philosophies for so many years. And one of the things that we've inherited is the SAD diet. And I'm actually happy it's called SAD, which stands for Standard American Diet, because in many ways it is sad. It's sad to consume it because it's lacking the macronutrient, but also now more importantly, as we've learned, the micronutrients as well. What was fascinating for me, Dr. Kaplan, when I was going through your work, is that typically when a clinician thinks about the role of nutrition, or even when one of our viewers might be thinking about the role of food and nutrition in their lives, they look at it through the lens of physical health, either management or keeping chronic diseases at bay, or trying to focus themselves towards performance and longevity, which is honestly how I got so fascinated by this area as well. But your attack on this is coming from a very interesting perspective, which is around the relationship between what you eat and your brain health, hence the title of your book, The Better Brain. Before we get into the science of that, help us understand, how is it that you arrived at this destination in your journey, your career journey?
Okay. Well, first of all, I just want to point out that I often entitle my lectures Nutrition Above the Neck.
Nice.
Because I'm often, like in a symposium or something, there are all kinds of people speaking about diabetes and cardiac disease, et cetera. And these are all very important. There are amazing breakthroughs coming. But the brain it's the greediest organ that we have in terms of nutrition. So we have to pay attention to it. So how did I get to it? Dr. Rani, my life course was very different from yours. I always knew I needed to be in science, but I didn't know what area. So I studied experimental psychology. I could tell right away I didn't want to be a clinician. I guess you don't do much clinical work yourself, do you?
Not that much anymore.
No. So at any rate, and so from there, I just noticed that I was always studying the biochemical basis of whatever we were studying in psychology. And that's how I'm kind of self-taught in whatever biochemistry I have grasped. And if you're going to look at biochemistry in terms of anything psychological, you're looking at nutrients. Even though physicians in medical school or medical students are not taught that very often, that's the essential aspect of linking nutrition to brain function. But then I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I looked at a couple of different postdoctoral fellowships, one involving nutrition, but it was not a good track for me because of the nature of the research group. So I thought, well, I'll learn more about neurophysiology. So I did a postdoc in neurophysiology. And then proceeded to embark on a career. This was down in the States in neurophysiology, doing animal research, and didn't really enjoy that. And then had the opportunity to move up to Canada and study clinical research aspects of childhood behavior. And that's what led me to this. And one of the reasons that I'm so passionate about it is that I spent my career here in a pediatrics department. And I know that my work and the work of others can protect the developing brains of children. And I know that you're having trouble with the mail there, but when you read chapter 12 in my book, where we talk, my co-author and I, Julia Ruckledge, talk about our vision for the future, one aspect of that is to protect those developing brains from being exposed to medication for as many years as possible. And we know we can do that with various steps that we walk through in the book.
So let's take the journey of a human being. I think that will act as a nice backdrop to thinking about the role of food and nutrition in our health, mental health. At what age do we start to see the effects, the negative effects on brain function, brain structure, brain metabolism through inadequate macro and micronutrient intakes?
Well, I'd have to say at birth. I mean, there's a wealth of information, mostly from developing countries, showing that nutrient quality of the nutritional intake of a pregnant woman has an impact on the growth and development of her child, and that includes brain function. So it's everywhere, it's every day, it's every month of every life. We are dependent upon feeding our brains, and our ancestors knew that. That's the thing that is most troubling to me, is that I've lived through this period of time where ancient wisdom has been lost. And it's been lost. It hasn't been just forgotten. It's been buried by the so-called psychopharmacology revolution, which I observed emerge in the 60s and 70s, and during my training period in the 70s. And everything that was known about nutrition as being so critical for mental resilience just disappeared.
Study after study have showcased that there's this correlation between what you put into your body and the effects. But can you take us through some of the key work that you've done through your own research, which has shown this association and how it affects mental health?
Sure. I'd like to embed it in, I usually think of it as 4 kinds of data. And my own research is really in the 4th category, but I think it helps to see it all together. So may I just do a review of that for you?
Yeah.
So over the years, since I'd say the 1960s, there have been at least a dozen really good nutritional epidemiology studies. These are population-wide. They've been done all over the world, and they've all shown pretty much the same thing. And that is that in countries where people are eating a healthier, well, that's judgmental, okay? A whole foods kind of diet. Yes, we have concluded it's healthier, but I mean, when they were doing the research, it wasn't certain. But when people were eating more whole foods, more fruits and vegetables, more of a Mediterranean style diet is how we usually think of it, that population-wide, there was less depression and anxiety. And if you looked at the groups that were eating within the populations that were eating less of that kind of whole foods diet, there was more symptomatology of mood and anxiety. So now this is only correlational, and correlation really can't prove anything. And to be very honest with you, I wish people would stop getting funded to do correlational studies in nutrition and mental health, because there's so much out there now. But it's an important clue that there's some relationship and it needs further investigation. Well, the second step, and it's harder to do, but it consists of a fewer number of studies, but very good ones from Australia, from the States, from Canada, showing prospective longitudinal studies. Actually, a very good one from Spain. I'll mention the Spain one as to illustrate how this is done.
This was the Sun Project, was it?
The Sun Project, exactly. And the Sun Project, I think, is better known for its work on cardiovascular symptoms, etc. And so their work in mental health is, I don't know if it's a sideline or not, but it isn't mentioned as often. But they had about 9,000 people who were mentally normal. They had no known mental disorders. They were evaluated for how closely they were following a whole foods Mediterranean style diet. And then people just kind of sat back and waited to see who would be diagnosed with depression. And the slide I usually show is from their 6-year data, and it showed it 6 years. And this is really interesting. When you divided people into thirds so that you had the people who were very adherent to a Mediterranean style diet, they didn't look that different from the people who were somewhat adherent. So the medium group. So what that said was, it's okay to eat a chocolate chip cookie occasionally, right? But they were basically following decent diet. The people who were not adherent at all, who were eating really much more of the SAD diet, as you referred to it, very highly processed diet, they had a very high rate of diagnosed depression. And that's been replicated in Australia and also in a group of children. And this is, maybe I should have used the Canadian studies on children, because whenever I talk about this, I feel like screaming, what are we doing to our kids? Because you can predict who is going to end up with a diagnosis, who's going to be referred for mental health problems based on characterization of their dietary intake 2 to 3 years prior. That's been shown in a group of children in Nova Scotia. It was published in Pediatrics in 2019. And the investigators included some from Alberta. And it's shocking, both from the point of view of, as I said, what are we doing to our kids? But also they did a cost analysis, Dr. Randy, and that was very revealing, because for every additional health behavior to which these children adhered, and most of them were dietary, for every one, there were 15% fewer referrals for mental health care. So think about the decrease in suffering, think about the decrease in cost to our healthcare budgets, and think about if we could get everybody to adhere to 1 or 2 more health behaviors, how we would change society.
This is
so that's the second type. Yeah.
Now I was just going to add, because as a young parent, and folks listening would know, I've got 2 young ones. Aiden is 5 and Eva is 2.5. As a young parent, we immediately see the effects of sugar. And I was speaking with Dr. Lustig on the last episode about the role of sugar in our health. And they jump up around, energy levels, etc. And there's a lot of conversational correlations between sugar and mental behaviors in children. But what's interesting is the direction you're going in. Is it's not just the addition of something in our food; it is the absence of other important cofactors, minerals, vitamins in the food, which is leading to that. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit more?
Sure. That's such an important issue to me. And it actually goes back to research I did in the 1980s. We did a randomized controlled trial that was published in Pediatrics in 1989, I think it was. And we showed that some little boys, they were all 3 to 5 years old, or 4 to 6 years old, 4 to 6 years old, who came in with really a lot of disinhibition and hyperactivity and impulsivity, etc. That when we gave them under completely blinded conditions, which is hard to imagine, but we succeeded with the blind. And when we put them on a clear diet that did not have additives and sugar, etc., that there was a significant improvement in their behavior. But what we didn't do, and so we interpreted it as the so-called additives were causing problems. But in those days, we weren't thinking about, well, what else was changing? Maybe it was because when you take the highly processed stuff out of your diet, what are you eating? You've got to eat something. So you're eating things that are more nutrient dense. But we had no way of looking at that then. Or maybe we didn't have the foresight to look at it then. And I think that that's true in the sugar literature.
Yeah.
I thought a lot of the sugar literature is confounded by, for example, your 2 children, when you see them reacting to sugar, are you sure it's the sugar, or is it the food products which the sugar is in? And is there other stuff in there? Or is it the absence of the micronutrients? Because when we fill ourselves up with 50%, as we're doing now, 50% of what we put in our mouths has virtually no micronutrients. I mean, my co-author, Julia Ruckledge, one day said, they'd probably be better off eating the boxes because at least they'd get some fiber.
That's very good. So you were
Yeah.
describing a sort of 4 phases. You're done 2, so there's
Right.
to go. Yeah.
So, okay, so I'll go on with the third one. So now we know that diet is, and this is why we wrote the book, by the way, Dr. Rani, is that the public doesn't know this. And this book is written for the general public. So now we know that diet is correlated with mental health. And now we also know that dietary intake can predict mental health problems. So the next step is to say, well, what can we do to improve mental health problems with a nutrition lens?
Yeah.
And that's the other 2 kinds of research that have gone on. So the whole of diet research, there are very few studies. There are only 3 that I can usually cite. And because I think they're really well done, and they are all from 3 independent laboratories, but they all happen to be from Australia. Pardon me. And what all 3 of them have shown is in randomized trials. Now, when you do a whole of diet intervention, there's no placebo, but there's an active comparator. So what in all 3 cases, they were comparing teaching people about the advantages of a whole food diet and how to change their diet to a Mediterranean style, and comparing that to peer support, social support, that kind of thing. And all of them found a big improvement in mood. They were all dealing with people with depression. They were all adults with depression. In one study that was dealing with people who had major depression, there was a 32% remission rate in 12 weeks. Now, I have never heard of an antidepressant that resulted in a 1/3 remission rate in 12 weeks with no side effects, of course. So that's very powerful. And that study, I think, got more media attention than any other study in our entire book. I wish the media had a greater interest in the whole picture. But anyway, that one attracted their attention. So that kind of study, we need more of them. We need more maybe with children. I really feel that's very important. But at least the consistency tells us that we should be teaching our patients, our clients with mental health problems. We should be educating, and this is at the end of our book where we talk about our vision for the future. We should be educating everyone with a mental health challenge or with mental problems in the family to eat a better diet. It's absolutely worthwhile. And you hear about so many side effects. I'm sleeping better. I'm thinking more clearly. etc. So that is a really strong area. My own research and the research of my co-author has been, we sometimes think of our research as proof of principle. We've been studying the use of broad spectrum micronutrients in pill form. Now, I would like to tell you why I have trouble calling them supplements. I will call them supplements for this interview. But in my view of the world, someday people will be taught to improve their diet. And if that's not sufficient, and we should talk about why that might not be sufficient, then they will be taught to take broad spectrum micronutrients in pill form. And if that's not sufficient to resolve their mental health issues, then of course there are all kinds of other things on the table, from cognitive behavior therapy, psychotherapy, social support, meditation, breathing, exercise, you name it. And also for some people, a bit of psychiatric medication. So in my worldview, medication should be the supplement. And that's not how it's done in North America. Right now, if you have a mental health problem, you are medicated first, and it should be the last. It should be supplementary to doing everything else. And the majority of people probably won't need it. So if we got them to improve lifestyle issues.
This is profound. This basically everyone listening in, especially those who are mental health practitioners or working in the area of mental health, which because of the pandemic has become the biggest challenge of our times, irrespective of which clinical specialty you're in, or any business leader or organization CEO, etc. You're all facing challenges around mental well-being at home and at the workspace. What Dr. Kaplan is proposing is the way we treat such individuals be flipped on its head. And we start with, it makes sense, let food be thy medicine. That goes back 2,000 years. We start with changing the food, what they eat, macro and micro. I love this broad spectrum micronutrients as a concept. And then progressing through to considering pharmaceutical intervention or CBT or other forms of behavioral therapies as well. That's an incredible thought to think about for this world.
Well, thank you. And that's why we have the subtitle that we have, which I can never seem to, I have to read it rather than say it, but it does cover the experimental literature on showing that with broad spectrum micronutrients, which means that spectrum we were talking about for plants, it's roughly 25 to 30 vitamins and minerals. Sometimes there are amino acids and antioxidants, etc. But the whole spectrum of vitamins and minerals, that there is research. It's not, it's not complete yet. I wish we had more. If any of your listeners are interested in doing research in this area, that's part of my goal as in my retirement years, is to foster more research. That's why I set up the charitable funds. And so we need more studies, but we know based on the research that's been done around the world, including that by myself and Julia Ruckledge, we know that we can have a very large impact on mood regulation. So that touches on bipolar symptoms, explosive rage, depression. We know that we can decrease anxiety, not for everyone, not completely. We don't know yet how big of an impact. The most consistent finding, though, and this is with case studies, our book is full of case studies and anecdotes for the general public. I think they relate to those, and they're real people. Case series, open label case series, randomized trials where we have active comparators, and also placebo-controlled trials. So the whole gamut of scientific data shows that a broad spectrum micronutrient formula, such as those that have been studied, that they can have an impact on people. And maybe this is where I should just add a little note so that your audience knows that my co-author and I are not commercially affiliated with any company, never have been, never will be. And that's very different from the majority of mental health studies, which are run by drug companies. So we decided to have no conflict of interest.
Yeah, very important point. And I know you often start your talks.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
I'm sorry. My cell phone responded to your voice. I turned it off. Yeah.
Siri and I often have chats with one another. I'm glad he thought it was a good time to come in, because it is a good time. We're sort of pivoting the conversation towards some of the more biochemical pathways involved in mental health. Now, a couple of threads really come out very strongly from your work. And of course, you've mentioned the microbiome already. And we're going to talk about its role in gut health as well. In fact, why don't we start with that? Why don't we start with the microbiome, and then we can get into the other aspects. So help us understand. So everyone listening will know, because we've spoken about the microbiome many times, which is it's expected to be 100 trillion cells, something ridiculously crazy like that, 3 to 4 kilograms of matter, symbiotic bacteria, virus, protozoa, etc., living and residing inside our gut. We now know that there's a gut-brain axis, and it's influenced not only on physical health, but also mental health as well. How is it that it plays a role, however, in mental health? Walk us through the science of that.
Okay, well, that's a very big question. Why don't I narrow it just a little bit to try to merge it with what we were talking about with broad spectrum micronutrients and what they're doing at a cellular level. So have you spoken about how mitochondria work to your audience at all, or do
We
they know
have,
about
and
that?
that's what I was going to get to next.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I think of that as the basis, so I'll start down there. Okay.
Okay.
So mitochondria are amazing little organelles, and you might not realize it. I mean, you do, obviously, Dr. Rennie, but some of your audience might not realize that we have them in every single cell in our body. And body includes brain in this case. Some of our cells have one or two, some of them have a dozen or more. And they're so critical because they produce our energy molecule ATP. But the complexity of what happens in those little organelles is phenomenal. And the complexity is a whole lot of steps. Pardon me, you've heard of Krebs cycle, you've heard of the electron transport chain, et cetera. And I'm sure you've talked at that level to your audience sometimes. But if we just look at the mitochondrion in the singular as this single kind of ovoid shaped organelle, the question is, what makes ATP get produced? Well, there are a whole lot of steps, but what goes into the mitochondrion to enable that to happen? And if you look at that, you're going to see mostly micronutrients. And if not a micronutrient, then a molecule that is synthesized from micronutrients. And so, to put it very maybe oversimplified, it's micronutrients in, ATP energy out. Now, how does that relate to inflammation, which is kind of the next step people talk about? I'm going to give you a little rant first, okay? It's kind of an axe that I like to grind whenever I can educate the public.
Before we get there, can I ask you a follow-up question on mitochondria? Because, it's no secret that I love mitochondria. In fact, I've dedicated a whole chapter in my book, which was about human performance. But it cropped up so many times that we had a whole chapter on mitochondria. And people listening would have heard me tell the story how in med school on Halloween one year, I dressed up as Captain Mitochondria because I was so obsessed with it.
That's great.
And it's overtaken so many aspects of my life now, even 20, 25 years later. But within that process, within the mitochondrion and the various processes, you've spoken about 30 key micronutrients. But if we could focus on some of the specific ones involved within those energy pathways for the mitochondria, what might be the ones which are key critical significance in the energy production of ATP?
Okay. I have to tell you that I do not like this kind of question. I'm going to tell you why first. Because we are human beings, we always have a tendency to look for a single magic solution. Not that you're doing that, Dr. Rennie, but there is that tendency. And I get asked all the time, well, which is the important nutrient? And I always say, I'm not going to answer that. It's the wrong question. In mitochondria, I'm not an expert in mitochondrial function, but I mean, I'll pick out one, lithium, for example. It's very interesting that people use massive doses of lithium, not biologic doses, but massive doses as a pharmaceutical for mood dysregulation.
Yeah.
Right. But the fact is that we do need lithium in the electron transport chain. It carries electrons from, I've forgotten now, step 2 to 3 or 3 to 4, whatever. It's in that chain. It is needed. And guess what? We get trace amounts in our vegetables. And that's what we need, are those trace amounts. You could find many of the micronutrients within the mitochondria doing things like that. But then it gets much more complex, because if you look at, for example, the synthesis of molecules like NAD, et cetera, which are so important for mitochondrial function, there are, it starts branching out. I'm gesturing here because it starts branching out. I've never been able to memorize them, but all the steps of each of the cycles that move toward that, you'll find in enzymatic activity, you'll find cofactors involving micronutrients going into it. It would be an interesting student project, actually, to break down all the input, all the steps that lead to the critical components for mitochondria and count up the micronutrients that you can find? I can't do that off the top of my head.
No, I ask purely from the perspective of, from a performance angle. People often look at the role of different substrates which go into the mitochondria or within the cell that then lead to the mitochondria to produce ATP. And of course, there's this big conversation around carbohydrate versus free fatty acids and how they play a specific role. But what's therefore often overlooked, and I'm so glad we're having this conversation, is that even for those substrates to enter in and eventually lead to that production of 31, 36 molecules of ATP, we need those catalytic agents. We need those micronutrients. And that is essentially where the whole process can break down, even though you've got the right substrate. If you haven't got the other actors in that process, then the system will break down. Yeah.
That's right. So you can see why, and this is where I was going to give you just a tiny little rant. When I read an article that talks about inflammation, and in the discussion section, which most people don't read anymore, it seems, but if you want to really understand the study, you've got to read the discussion section. You find them saying, well, we need drugs to improve our anti-inflammatory activity, and drugs could be developed to do this or that. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, wouldn't you do it with your own ATP if you were adequately nourished? So there's this tendency, even when people are looking at the microbiome and mitochondrial function and talking about, inflammation is the basis of depression. Well, I don't doubt that actually has not been borne out. A recent study just appeared in, actually, I just had it out here, if you don't mind my taking a quick look, in the American Journal of Psychiatry just last month, that the link between inflammation and depression is not as generally solid as people wanted it to be. But even if it were, what does it mean? Does it mean that you need an anti-inflammatory drug, or does it mean that you're not maximizing your intake of the micronutrients, which will maximize your production of ATP? ATP is, I mean, let me back up for a minute. Again, I know that you know this, but for your audience, inflammation is not a bad thing, right? Inflammation is the way we fight infections. It is excessive inflammation, which seems to be associated with a lot of problems. And the fact is that we are this amazing creature with all kinds of organs that have homeostatic mechanisms. And so we have ways to keep things within an acceptable range. And a perfect example is when we develop too much inflammation, if we are well nourished, we will produce more of our own anti-inflammatory energy molecule, which is ATP. So to me, the answer again should be first, improve your diet. And last, or second really, is if that's not sufficient, consider micronutrients, a broad spectrum formula in pill form.
In your paper that you published a few years ago, which was titled "The Emerging Field of Nutritional Mental Health," you spoke about inflammation, microbiome, oxidative stress, and mitochondrial dysfunction as well. And what was interesting is that you were also looking at certain elevated, or you found that there was certain elevated biomarkers associated with this brain dysfunction that we're seeing. Things that people may have heard of, which is CRP, C-reactive protein, marker of inflammation, cytokines, and homocysteine as well. Could you elaborate on that science a little bit for us?
Sure, except that this study that came out last month is saying it's not so simple. But at the time we wrote that article, it seemed to be pretty clear that inflammation these inflammatory biomarkers did indicate some problem which was associated with dysfunction, including at the brain level. I should say that the reason that article, which isn't cited all that often, but it meant a lot to me. It was, sometimes you look back at your career and there may be a handful of your articles that you think really were flagship for you in pulling material together. At the year we wrote that article, which was what, 2015, I think, or 16, somewhere there. It seemed to me that people were talking about these phenomena separately, like, oh, it's the microbiome when we're talking about mental illness, right? Oh no, it's inflammation. And I realized, well, they don't understand the relationship between the microbiome and inflammation. And oh, it's this, oh, it's that. So the point of that article was to show how these things fit together. And by the way, as we concluded the article, the common pathway that is relevant to all of them has to do with optimal nutrition. Optimal micronutrient intake is critical for optimal function of all of them. So that's how it fit together for me.
Fantastic.
I'm not sure I answered your question though.
No, I mean, you sort of did, and where I was interested in also hearing a little bit more about it is that when we for the clinicians who are listening to this, they're sitting in their clinic and they're looking at CRPs, homocysteines, etc. We tend to look at it through the lens of, okay, this is for cardiovascular health, or there's some inflammatory cascade going on, maybe infection. But what I found interesting was that there is also an element that affects our mental health and the effects on brain metabolism as well. Yeah.
Well, I would turn that upside down if you don't mind.
Yep.
Okay, and I'll tell you why. These things affect our mental health, our brain health, and by the way, they also affect our bodies. And I'll tell you why I'm turning it upside down. I was taught in school, you've got to eat well to have strong bones and strong muscles. That's how we're still teaching our kids, and it's really backwards. Because our brain is only about a kilogram. It's about 2% of our weight at most. And yet it, as I think I said earlier, I referred to it as the greedy organ. It is consuming 20 to 40% of the micronutrients, the oxygen, et cetera, the energy that is being consumed in our body. So when we eat, we are feeding our brains. And by the way, some of it's going to our muscles and bones. But that's not the way children are taught. We've got to, in my lifetime, I hope we can change our health curricula for both children in elementary school and right up through physicians in medical school, and teach that micronutrients that nutrition is the foundation of all of our resilience, which our ancestors knew, but also that the micronutrients are so critically important for brain health. We haven't talked about the research on dementia, but we do touch on that in our book. And you just watch the studies coming out now, time and again. I don't care that the FDA has just approved a drug that may or may not help dementia. What is the point in looking at that? It's so clear from longitudinal studies like the Vitacog trial from Oxford that showed that nutrients will prevent dementia and prevent brain cell loss. And there are other studies from the US on that. Martha Claire Morris's long-term study in the MIND diet, for example.
Yeah.
So we should be paying attention to this. But no one is. We're still talking only about diabetes and heart disease, and that's a mistake.
No, that's precisely why we need more folks like you writing more books like this and spreading the message for everyone out there. Let's look at some of the simple things then that people can do, right? And I like to talk about it in the sense of biohacks, not biohacks wearing technology or doing expensive or interventions, but the really simple things that we can do in our day-to-day lives that will ensure that we're leading a life which will be happy, healthy, and long as well. What should the plate look like? Let's start with that. What should the ideal plate look like?
Okay, the ideal plate would have nothing that came in packages that were processed foods. I realize there are some packages, you can't just say no packages, right? I mean, you can get, I don't know, there are healthy things you can get in packages. Yeah. Excuse me. But nothing that is ultra processed. And that means with the refined carbs and no micronutrients, no vitamins and minerals, or virtually none. So there will be none of that on your plate. So what does that leave? It leaves real food. And of course, we get a lot more of the micronutrients and phytonutrients and the better spectrum of them from vegetables and fruit. The Mediterranean style diet really emphasizes beans and lentils. And that's the way to save money. Just as a little side note, we have to dispel the myth. I don't know if you have this myth in India, because your food, your diet is so different from North America, I think. But in North America, people think they cannot afford to eat a whole foods Mediterranean style diet. They have to eat processed fast foods. But it is the exact opposite. And this was shown in one of the Australian studies, and many clinicians have replicated this with their own patients, that if you drop the processed fast foods, which really are expensive, they add up and they don't really fill you up, and you learn how to cook with beans and legumes, which I think probably more people do in India, and whole grains, that you are saving money. There are also snacking things like nuts and seeds, which again, in North America, that can be expensive. So you have to keep an eye on that. Using olive oil as your preferred oil, or avocado oil, the really good fats. If you eat meat and dairy, making sure that it's as healthy as possible, and not necessarily, I'm not going to get into the fat argument, lean or not, that's that's too controversial, but to be able to try to avoid factory farmed food, But the main things were the first few items. So that's what your plate will look like. And you will be healthier. You have to make sure you're getting enough fiber, crunchy kinds of food. Those are your prebiotics. Have you taught your audience about the difference between prebiotics and probiotics and what they can do?
We actually had a conversation with Dr. Lustig around probiotics and water soluble and insoluble fibers. But of course, I'd love to hear your perspective on that as well.
Well, if you eat a whole foods kind of diet, you're going to be feeding your microbiome better, because the healthy bugs, the ones that you want to maintain and you want them to colonize your gut, they depend upon you to feed them. And when you eat a bag of chips, you're not feeding them. But when you eat healthy, fibrous, prebiotic, someone once said recently, I'm sorry, I can't remember who to attribute this to, that every produce section in every grocery store should have a sign saying, this is where you get your prebiotics, because people don't realize that, but that's where we get them.
Yeah.
So if you do all of that and you're exercising and you have family support, then you're probably going to be doing okay. But we have very good reason to believe that is not sufficient for everyone with mental health problems, and that some people have inherited the need, as Linus Pauling predicted in the 1960s, for more of those micronutrients, which are the catalytic agents to make your brain metabolism work, than some other people have inherited. It's all a matter of individual differences. And he predicted that is what accounted for mental illness running in families, that's what is inherited. And I think someday we'll figure out that he was right. So for those people, taking additional micronutrients in pill form might be advantageous. Yeah. Now, those especially people fall into...
imagine the fact how we started the conversation about the quality of food going down, the quality of the soil changing, etc. Yeah. It's probably naturally lesser in food. Yeah.
But support your local agriculture people, get to know them, create demand for healthy food. That's what we can do if we are not, living on farms ourselves. Within the micronutrient in pill form, or I'll call them supplements, within the supplement literature, there are kind of two categories that I'd like to mention in terms of mental resilience, if I may. Okay. Yep. If you do not have a a real mental disorder, whatever I mean by that, like an ongoing generalized anxiety disorder or something like that. But you're simply a person who's going through a very stressful period. Just taking additional B vitamins has been shown in quite a few studies to improve your mental health resilience, to enable you to cope with stress better. I mean, we can't take all stressors away. We couldn't get rid of the pandemic, could we? But if more people were eating better and taking, say, a B complex, just over-the-counter B complex once every day, their resilience would be stronger. That is not going to help people who have a really clear mental disorder, people who have ongoing depression, etc. And that's where the broad spectrum micronutrients and those formulas that have been studied, and we review the ones that have been studied in chapter 11 of our book, that's where they come in. Those are the only ones for which we have very clear scientific data showing relief of symptoms in many people.
This is important because I remember in med school, we were taught omega-3, omega-6. Myelin sheath around nerves, effective for cellular membrane, particularly neural membranes, and of course that spills over into a lot of the literature that we read in the media. But what you're saying is that it's much wider than that. Obviously, vitamin B is a big one, but there are so many others that we need to also be taking. Yeah.
Right, and also I haven't said very much about the omegas. I mean, the problem with our diet is that our omega-3s are out of balance. We don't get nearly enough relative to the other ones like omega-6. Yeah. So taking omega-3s, both for our brain and our hearts, is a really good idea. Eating fish a couple times a week, which I think many parts of India do better than we do in North America, is one way to really do that. But that's because our cellular structure is so dependent upon omega-3s, right? Very much so. This is an oversimplification for sure, but I tend to think about omega-3s for our cell walls and for our structural integrity of our brain. Not that they aren't relevant elsewhere, but as I say, I'm simplifying it. But I think about the vitamins and minerals for the dynamic function. Every minute of every day, our brain pathways have to have access to an abundance of those micronutrients as cofactors, or else we have sluggish pathways. That's my term. It's not a scientific one. But that is probably a distinction for which there is a bit of truth.
We are coming towards the end of the conversation, and a question that I love to ask all the folks that I have the honor of chatting to is what are you optimistic about?
That's a really interesting question, because I feel like I've been beating my head against a brick wall for many years, and the brick wall includes pharmaceutical influence and psychiatrists who are still just doing psychopharmacology because that's what they were taught. So I'm optimistic about the new generation of people who are understanding that nutrition is important to our health, and that we should not be a drug-first society because it's not working. It's not solving any of our problems. And so I see a change in the last 5 years, just 5, and I'm not exaggerating. And I've been working at this for decades, but the last 5 years, I think more people are open to it. More people want to change curricula. And more people maybe will be ready to talk to their clients and their patients about their diets. And, one of the things on my website, I haven't asked you this, but I hope that when you post this, you'll put my website on as a resource. And from there, you can find our book, of course, but also I have some videos there and tips for clinicians. And one of them, I discovered that I'd given a few lectures to family doctors, and I discovered that they were uncomfortable raising the issue of nutrition and diet with their patients, and partly because they felt they were not a model of eating well. Okay. So, and that's okay. I mean, do whatever you want on your own time. But they just felt it was patronizing to bring it up with their patients. So I provide the wording, how to present it, just a simple thing like there's more and more research that how we feel is affected by what we eat. Can we talk about your diet? And then 4 questions to ask for which there are no right or wrong answers. There is no scoring involved. They're conversation openers. So like, how often do you drink sweetened drinks? How often do you eat vegetables? About how many times a day do you think you get a fruit or a vegetable? That kind of thing. How often do you buy do you use the term fast food or takeaway?
Yeah.
Yeah. So fast food or takeaway, asking those questions and then saying, and then your patients will say to you, oh, that's something I really could improve on. And then you can be supportive. And I think it can evolve into a good conversation. That's what I'm optimistic about, is that clinicians are more willing to embark on those conversations.
Fantastic. Dr. Bonnie Kaplan, we've learned all about nutrition from the neck up today.
Right.
We're all really excited. Everyone listening to this, please do, and we'll make sure the website's in the show notes and we link it back to where people can get a copy of your book, The Better Brain. Thank you very much for your time this evening on The Edge.
Thank you.